Nice. So welcome. This is going to be a tour of Django. Before we get into that, a little bit about me and why I might have a slight clue of what I'm talking about, although those who know me might be a little skeptical. My name's Sean. I work at Bitly as lead application engineer. I run our back-end development team. In the past, I've ran Django NYC, which is one of the largest Django user groups, for about 4 or 5 years. Kind of stepped back for personal reasons, but still involved a little bit there. And I also helped organize DjangoCon US for a few years. So I'm pretty involved there. So Django, what is it, right? Well, to start, it's Python. And actually, that's something that's really important to keep in mind all the way through as we get into things. Django offers a lot of different things out of the box, but at the end of the day, it's just Python. If you have the question, can Django do X? The answer is almost certainly the same to the question, can Python do X, right? So there's nothing crazy. There's no real weird environment or anything like that. It's just Python. So remember that. Django is not a CMS. So something that comes up a lot when people kind of hear about Django, and one of the questions that'll come up is, okay, so I can just install Django and then have a website, right? Like, not quite. If you do, pip install Django, from the perspective of having a website, you're basically still in the same place, right? Instead, Django is a framework, right? It's a pile of tools that make it easier to build web applications as a developer, right? So there are some of those tools that eventually may produce an interface or make it easier to produce an interface, but it's not going to be something like Drupal or WordPress where you just plop it down in a box, point at a database, and you got a website, right? Going beyond that, it's that's fun. It's an opinionated framework. Getting a little trim there. And what that means is basically when you're designing something like a framework, there's always trade-offs as far as basically flexibility versus speed, and it's not always like a strict dichotomy, but one of the approaches that Django takes is it has fairly firm opinions about how certain things should be done or how they should be structured. And while you can do things differently, it's going to slow you down, right? So as you learn about Django, you likely want to check it every so often and see, is the way Django's encouraging you to do things in line with how you want to do things? If you find yourself constantly fighting with it and constantly wanting to do things a different way, then maybe this isn't the right tool for you. On the other hand, if it all just makes sense, awesome, great, you'll do just fine. So from here, the plan is going to basically be to give you a lightning speed overview of just all the bits and pieces that's going on in Django. So stepping back and recapping real quick, Django is a web framework written in Python. And one of the opinionated, and going beyond that, part of the opinions is it's a batteries included framework, right? So that means that it basically comes with all the things you should need off the bat, right? Obviously, there's lots of specialized cases where you may pull in third-party libraries, but everything you need to get a fairly sophisticated web application done comes in the box with Django. There's lots of different approaches to building something. There's things like Turbo Gears, which I guess is now Pyramid. Ish, right? That takes another approach where it's more just like cobbling together lots of different libraries that exist together. Django's the other way around. So to that end, this is going to be showing you all the different batteries that are in there, just top level, hey, this is a thing, this is where to find out, here's where to find out more, and give you a starting place to then go, oh, I should check that out for my project, or I should read more there, or I should go play around with that, right? We're not going to get super in-depth, but certainly feel free to ask questions as I go along or hold to the end.
So is it MVC then? Is there a controller also?
Ish. So we'll get into it a little bit as this is structured. In the Django world, they call it MVT, Model View Template. The nuances of which get a little, depends on how much you care about nuance, but it's a similar kind of separation of concerns. It's just a bit of a different approach to it. What you see here is a version of the Django documentation. So if you go to docs.djangoproject.com, You'll see a slightly different styled version of this. This is just the offline docs. I've learned over the years giving presentations relying on conference Wi-Fi is a really bad idea. But the actual content and the structure is all the same. So if you go to djangoproject.org, you'll see something very similar. And this is one of the best features of Django, is it has by far some of the best documentation I've seen for any project, period. So accordingly, the way this tour is going to work is we're going to basically just blow through the documentation, right? I'm going to go through highlighting what's cool, what's interesting, what you should look at, where you should dig in, and then also, since we're following the actual documentation, it should hopefully give you a little bit of that like location memory kind of thing of like, oh, what was that thing? It was kind of over here. So we'll see how this goes, right? And if you look at how the documentation's set up, it is actually set up reasonably well. It's effectively kind of like a narrative, right? So it starts off with a tutorial, right? Just giving you like, hey, if you've never done Django before, you should probably go through this, right? And we're not going to go through that here because personally I find doing tutorials in a talk unbelievably boring. But on your own computer, on your own time, digging in and actually going through the tutorial and going through the motions of getting something working is pretty awesome. The Django tutorial is a great starting place. From there, it gets into the basically big picture pieces, right, that you need to get into an app, relating to the MVC setup, right? Your major separations and concerns, and then all the details inside of that, right? So you have models, you have views, you have templates, and then you have all kinds of other bits and pieces that then fall in to give you everything inside of there, right? So kind of following that pattern, we're going to start off with the models, right? So what's a model, right? So a model is a way of programmatically describing the structure of your data, right? The data of your application. Under the covers, eventually, right, this ends up becoming database tables. So one of the things that comes out of the box with Django is an ORM, or an object or relational mapper. So you basically build up these object-oriented Python objects that then have a mapping back to a relation, right, a row and a column, or a row and a table in a database. And a lot of times you might look at this and say, well, why do I want to bother doing that? It seems like I'm doing a lot of work for, select star from wherever, right? And sometimes you might want to do that. But by having this central programmatic description of your data, there's lots of really nice kind of things you can get relatively for free or very easily on that basis, right? So to that end, models come with a bunch of functionality out of the box. So once you define your model and describe your data, you can do a bunch of things. One of them is you can do queries, right? So these are kind of going to be some examples that we're using here. Don't worry too much about the details, obviously, from where you guys are saying that's a freaking eye chart. But you have blogs, you have authors, they have entries, they have relationships to each other, and they have attributes that make sense for each of those things, right? So if I want to create a blog, I can just import my blog class, create an instance, call save on it, and congratulations, I just created around the database. Super easy. Modifying it, again, more or less works as you expect. Say, take an instance, modify an attribute, call save, does what you want. You can have relationships between objects, so you have foreign key fields and many-to-many relationships. The details on this, you can go on for quite some time and get really complicated, but you get the basic idea there. You can create a bunch of related instances, associate them with each other. It'll do whatever it needs to do under the covers to either populate foreign key fields or do join tables or so on. So anyway, there, and then as you might expect, you can delete things, right? So you have an instance of something, you call delete on it, and removes it from the database, and you're all set. Or you can select a bunch of things and then delete that in bulk, right? Again, lots more you can do here. If you're interested, go to the docs. You'll keep on finding lots of fun things, as you can see from the scrolling. So that's great. So we can now do the, CRD, the CRUD parts, right? So we can do all the modification stuff. But let's look at the R in that, right? Read, retrieve. So we can kind of do the easy case of just give me all the entries, right? Just give me everything, right? So we can do that. Basically what you get back is, when you get into the details, it's a query set. It kind of looks like a list, but it's smarter. And then from there, you can do stuff like filtering, right? So you can say, give me all the entries with a published date in the year 2006. Django has been around for about 10 years, so some of the years in this will be a bit old. And you can do all kinds, like you can get really complicated in this, right? And this is actually one of those places where people start to get really twitchy around ORMs, right? Because when you start describing really complex queries programmatically, having that library generate sane SQL code for those complex queries is a fiendishly hard problem, and usually at some point breaks down. So while you can build up complex stuff, and there are situations where you may want to do that, right? Because you could do all kinds of clever stuff, like doing this maybe programmatically based off of form inputs or something like that. Like you can do all kinds of fun things there. But at the end of the day, if you really need to, you can just drop down to raw SQL. This has the obvious warning of, at this point, you're losing, if you're not careful, you can lose all the built-in SQL injection protection that Django's ORM provides. So, with great power. But you can do something like here, where we have our person with the first name, last name, so on. And then we can just do, call the raw method on our manager there, objects, and just give it the SQL that we want to run. But what we get in response is still kind of the same thing as we get from doing the more programmatic style, right? So we still get our nice model instances that we can just interact with as we would have before, but we can do whatever crazy, insane SQL query that we need to do to meet our business needs or whatnot, which can be pretty nice.
I'm sorry,
Yep.
it returns a query set still, or no?
It technically returns a flavor of a query set. It's a more restricted query set, so you can't go modify the query afterwards, but otherwise it behaves the same, and the instances that it returns from the query set are identical to something you get from a query set.
Question. Can you make your queries parametric so that you can also make sure that there's no...
Yes, yeah, so there are proper ways to do proper escaping and handle that, absolutely. And that's all covered in the raw queries documentation. It more or less looks the same as the Python DB API, but you can get into it. Something else that you get from programmatically describing your data is migrations. So actually, this is a fairly new feature in Django. Landed, I believe, in the latest release in 1.7. Before this, there was a third-party project called South that was probably the most common way to handle database migrations, right? So with any real project, your data changes, right? You're going to have to add fields, modify fields, do that, right? And you need some way to manage that across all your different environments, right? So every developer has their own local copy, and then you have some staging environments, and then you have production. Ideally, you have to translate those changes into those different environments, and ideally that's tied to your code in some way, right? So migrations provides a way to do that, and also then provides a bunch of nice automation around that to just take care of well, you knew what it used to be and you know what it is now, so just do it for me, right? So here you can just say, manage.py is something in Python or in Django where it's kind of like your main entry point in the command line for doing Django things. So you can say manage.py make migrations, and it'll just generate a migration file for you, basically inferring what has changed between the last known version of your schema and your current models. So here, basically, you wouldn't necessarily change the database yet. You would just update your models, run this command, and it would infer the change. And then similarly, you can just, on any particular install, let's say you check out new code, and you know that database changes happen, you can run manage.py migrate, and it'll just apply the changes to your database and do whatever alters or creates or need to be done to get you to the current state. And the way this works under the covers is it generates these Python files called migration files. And again, these just basically programmatically describe what has changed, right? And it does it so in a way that it can basically infer what the old state of your database is, right? So you have this fun problem of if you're doing this where, like I said, you update your model file, and then you need to say, make migration, it needs to know what the old state was. There's been a lot of really gross ways that's been done in the past of making strings of Python code to save the old state or whatever. This is new and much happier and much saner in that it's programmatically describing all the changes, so we can actually figure out what the old state was based on previous migrations. It can also do some clever stuff like collapse down migrations over time. I've certainly been on some projects where you end up with 500 migrations over the span of 2 years. And when you're starting from fresh, That can take a little while. So it can be nice to be able to collapse things down and just say, just give me the delta. I don't actually care about all those interstitial states. But you might, so it gives you the tools to flexibly deal with that. Once again, like everything, this is just a tease to say, hey, this is here, this is cool, you should check it out. Here's where to find out more. So go check that out. Going beyond what we just talked about, so that's kind of just the basic stuff that the ORM provides. There's a ton more stuff in here that you can get into that can be really useful depending on what you're looking to do. So some of the things include there's managers, so like if you have really common like sets, like let's say like base queries, if you will, right? So like say you have like a multi-tenant system, right? Where all your users, all their data, like all your tables have like a organization column, right? And step one for any query you're gonna run is organization equals current org, right? You can basically have something that makes your query set, so instead of saying like mything.objects.all, you can say mything.currentuser.all, right? And just have that handled all over the place for you and just have to write that once. The raw SQL stuff we touched on real quick, there's a ton of tools for doing transaction management, both for doing it in an automated way, like potentially wrapping every request in a transaction, so at least from a user experience standpoint, everything happens consistently. And some more finer grain controls if you need to do something more nuanced. Aggregations, right? So SQL databases are reasonably good at those. It exposes them in a pretty nice way. And then a bunch of tools for doing various forms of customization of the ORM, for particularly supporting more like obscure database features. And the other thing that's nice about having all your data described programmatically is now you've abstracted away the details of what database you're using, right? So now, obviously, you can get into more nuanced situations where there's no longer the case, but out of the box, vanilla Django models will work on MySQL, Postgres, SQLite, Microsoft SQL, Oracle, I think various flavors of IBM databases with some third-party drivers, and more, right? So especially if you're building something open source, you're looking to distribute, and you don't want to necessarily have a strong opinion about what database is going on, that's very nice. Right, and there's also a lot of documentation around providing guidance about like how to write things in a portable way, what's supported, what's not, handling common use cases like loading like initial data like fixtures, as well as providing some guidance like, hey, you can technically do this, but it's going to be really slow and a bad idea. Maybe do it this way. Again, really thorough and solid documentation. And all this is super kept up to date. Continuing our whirlwind tour, moving down to the view layer, right? So like I said, this is a web framework. Presumably at some point we're going to want to handle HTTP requests and then do something in response to that. So views are kind of like your main entry point on how you do that. So a reasonable place to start in a web framework is usually how you handle dispatching and how you handle basically routes, right? Like URLs, how do you figure out that foo/bar/1 means something and where that goes, right? So this is more or less how Django handles that. So here, basically, you set up a series of these objects where you have a regular expression describing the path that you want, and then you give it a callable, which in Python could be a function, but it could also be certain classes of special objects. And basically, whenever a request comes in and the path matches, it'll basically go down that list in order. And whenever it gets the first match, it'll then send the request to that callable, and you're all set. Like everything else here, there's lots of fun things you could do. So this is kind of showing a more kind of full picture, right? So we have our URL patterns right here, and then you can get down and you can see like it's just a function that gets passed the arguments. You can do groups within regular expressions to capture like if like a certain portion of the URL fragment has a meaning that you want to pass in as an argument to your view. That's how that works. What we got here? Oh, yeah, this was just kind of, oh, right. Something else that's pretty awesome is you can reverse these URLs, right? So a lot of times when you're getting into a larger web application, you can get into this problem of you end up like hard coding these like functions to build URLs all over the place, and if you ever want to change the path to something, you end up having to change code in a whole bunch of places, and it's not even an easy find and replace because you're often building those strings. They're not just baked in. So Django provides a functionality where you can describe your URLs using these patterns, and that has a bunch of functions for templates and for within Python code to say, given these inputs, give me back the URL for that. So now your URLs are just defined in one place, and you have a consistent way for generating those URL strings back for like generating links or redirects or whatnot, which can be really nice. Again, lots more functionality available here that I'm going to show. You should check it out. But this was one of the things, especially when I was doing more CMS type stuff, was really, really nice, and made projects much easier to maintain over time. One last thing I'm going to highlight here that, again, in your first project probably doesn't matter too much, but as you get like a larger code base, it gets really important, is you can effectively include other URL files, right? So usually you have one URL file on the root of your project. That's where things start. I've seen some Django projects where you have literally like 2,000 line files like that, just full of like thousands of regexes, and it's insane, right? Both from a maintenance standpoint, from finding anything, also from a performance standpoint, right? If you're matching something at the bottom of that list, you just had to do 1,000 regular expression matches on every request, which is not great. So what Django provides is you can basically say, for this regular expression, go and check out the URLs in this file, or in this module, excuse me, Python module, right? And then that gives you an organizational tool to break this down into meaningful pieces. But additionally, then it can be a performance thing, right? So I can just say, top level, match on this, and then go look at this more detailed list for that, right? So let's you be a bit smarter about that. Again, lots more to dig into. Go check it out. So let's look at a bit more what the actual views can look like. One thing, this is one of those places where this is really, really, really true of Django is just Python, right? And views are just callables that get passed a request, optionally any parameters you capture during your regular expression match, and then expect an HTTP response back, right? The details of how you do this, Django does not care, right? So it could be a function as simple as this, but it could be something much more sophisticated depending on what you're looking to accomplish. And Django will provide some of that, but you can do kind of whatever you want. So here's a really simple example, right? So we get a request, we figure out what the current time is, we generate some HTML, and we spit it back out. But if you're looking at this, you probably can start seeing that, well, that seems like if I actually do something more meaningful and less trivial than that, this is going to become a lot of boilerplate really fast, right? Like I'm going to have to do, like I don't want to be doing string interpolation for templating. There's probably a lot more details on the HTML, HTTP response that I care about that I will be consistent but still need control over, right? Like, how do I make this a little better, all right? So some of that works in the form of there's kind of different flavors of responses that come out of the box, right? So a not found response is really common, right? So there's one of those. Additionally, you can do stuff like raise HTTP 404 exception, right? Again, if you're in some really deep logic, you might not be in a place where it's easy for you to necessarily return a 404, but this lets you kind of just say, like, look, just stop doing everything. We don't know what's going on. Just return a 404, right? And there's a bunch of functionality in there for doing other error types like that, managing like customizing those error pages, so on and so forth. Additionally, Django offers a bunch of shortcuts, right? So again, you can kind of see there's a whole page. One of the more commonly used ones is this render to response, right? So here, a really common pattern that you'll have in a web application is, I have a view, I'm going to put together some data, and then I'm going to shove it in a template and return an HTTP response, right? So instead of having a boilerplate on every view to do that, there's just a function, right? And it just takes the name of a template and a context, and it takes care of everything else for you. And it's great. But then what's really nice is actually, so this is reasonably well documented, but you could also, like, Django's open source, so you can just go look at the source code, and it's super clean, understandable code, right? Like, granted, I'd say there's usually some degree of documentation failure if you have to go look at the source code. But if you do end up looking at the Django source code, like if you want to look at the right way to do Python projects for most things, the Django source code is not a bad place to look. And then there's a bunch of other shortcuts that are nice there for like redirects and so on. Again, it's all these things, like, of course you could write this yourself, but there's probably something more interesting you could be doing with your time. So just use this. Oh, sorry, skipped ahead, or did I? Oh, so remember I was talking about you can do more crazy, sophisticated things? This is one of them. So in addition to doing just straight functions as views, Django has this concept of class-based views. You could completely implement this on your own. It'll work inside of Django just fine. This just kind of provides a common way that people tend to do it just because it's baked in. So what do I mean by class-based view, right? So I'm saying it's something that I'm going to import in my URLs file. And instead of just calling or just leaving there as a function, I'm going to do this template as view thing, right? And the benefit to doing something like this is it lets me have really easily pluggable logic, right? So I can define a class, right, that does whatever 90% is going to be common across a bunch of different views, and then just override the one portion that is relevant to this particular view, right? Which is nice. The gotcha here is it's the classic like seduction of power of object-oriented programming, right? Like you can start getting down some really crazy roads where like you have mixins and mixins of mixins and crazy object hierarchies, and you can get to the place where like figuring out where the particular thing that modified your context or whatever, or modified your code, involves looking at 18 files, right? And that's not a happy place. So again, this is a place where there's lots of powerful things included, but you also have to remember to be careful about what's there. Something else I'm not going to get a whole lot terribly deep into, but just be aware that it's there. Django both provides like a base kind of layer for like this is what we think class-based view should look like. It's just in terms of classes that handle HTTP requests and return a response. But then they also provide a bunch of kind of more sophisticated, more built-up ones that are really common patterns, right? So like basically, fetch an object, pass that into the template and render a response, right? Or get a list of objects and pass that to the template and return a response, right? Like those kinds of like really common CMS-y type things. There's a bunch of built-in class-based views that will provide that out of the box to you. Again, nice, be careful, read up. Here's a little bit of example. The built-in ones tend to have like methods that map to HTTP methods, right? So if you want to override the head behavior, you just define a head method on there and you can work with that. Can be nice. So yeah, like I said, lots of cool stuff here. The documentation on this has gotten a lot better for a long time, class-based views. This was one of those places where to figure out what's going on, you had to look at the source code. That still sometimes kind of sort of happens, but it's gotten a lot better. Class-based views, they're cool, but used with care. Some other things that Django has a bunch of tooling around, we're not going to get super into, is handling file uploads. One of the things that's really nice here is they have custom storage engines or pluggable storage engines. So you can have fairly common code for handling, like I'm going to accept like an image or attachment or whatever, and then just have it be a configuration change to say that if that just gets uploaded to the local file system, or if that goes to S3 or whatever Rackspace's equivalent is, or so on and so forth, right? Which can be really nice, again, especially if you're making an open source project that people are going to reuse in different environments. It also can be nice just that writing code to deal with S3 can be kind of annoying, so just having something that you can plug in and have just work is nice. And a bunch of kind of more sophisticated examples of what's going on, so generating like alternate response types other than HTML, they have some examples of. Additionally, Django has a middleware framework. So the idea here is,
What are mixins?
Yeah, so imagine you just want to have a common piece of functionality that you want to pull into a class, but you don't want to necessarily have it be specific to any one class. You can kind of think of it as like, if you just implemented a partial object or a partial class that by itself makes no sense, but if you inherit from that and another thing, then they come together to be a same thing. So I guess a really quick version of that. So jumping back quick, middleware. A lot of times there are situations when you're building web applications where you just want to do one thing on every single request that's coming in, or inspect every request for something. For example, like header injection for doing like clickjacking protection or stuff like that. Middleware provides a way to do that. which is relatively clean. Obviously, if you're doing something at every request, you have to be careful about what you're doing because you can make things slow really fast. But yeah, so that's there. So kind of bubbling up. Yep.
Question about generating PDF. How
Yep.
doing it and how strong is it?
So Django doesn't have anything specific to PDFs built into it. The example there is basically saying like you basically describes you doing whatever you got to do to generate like this is the binary I want to spit out over the wire, and then how to handle like setting the right headers in the response, and then actually manage piping that binary data from wherever you generated it out through the response. So yeah, Django doesn't have any particular PDF stuff built into it, I don't believe. But there's lots of Python libraries that do. So again, it's just Python, so figure out how you're going to generate the PDF, and then Django has a way to then pipe that back out to the client. And potentially can do so in either just like whole blob way or in more of a streaming way, so you don't necessarily have to have the whole thing in memory, which can be useful when you have multi-meg PDFs. So moving on. This one I'm not going to get super deep into. Templates, they're a thing. Django templates are pretty nice. They generally kind of look like this. Particular things to highlight here are templates have this idea of inheritance. So you can actually have templates inherit from each other and just override the portions that they particularly care about, which can be actually a really nice, flexible way to deal with stuff that isn't just strictly includes. Allows you kind of have just layers and layers of stuff as it makes sense. Some other things that are worth mentioning here is that, again, the template implementation is all just Python. It means it's kind of slow, but it also means that you can provide your own, like everything that you see on here as far as like these kind of filters or custom tags or whatnot, like you can just build your own pretty well. The API for that's completely documented. You can see lots of examples out there for that. What else was there? Templating languages. Right now, technically, you can use other templating languages. It's not super convenient. I think that's one of the major milestones for the next release of Django is to build out tooling to make plugging in other templating languages easier. And the last thing I would highlight from a security standpoint, which is nice, is by default, everything that you're outputting here, so like this session.title thing here, right, we're outputting a variable. That is HTML escaped by default, right? So this goes a long way towards preventing cross-site scripting bugs. Obviously, you can, defeat yourself here and work around it and turn it off, but the defaults are sane and safe, which is nice. Again, lots more you can dig into, both in terms of built-in functionality that's in the templates or ways to extend it. All of that is very well documented. So here, the documentation is kind of split up into people writing templates versus people building tools for templates, which makes sense. Next up, doing pretty okay on time, forms. When I was doing more CMS workflow style heavy work, I absolutely love Django forms because I hate writing HTML form with a passion, or form handling code with a passion, right? Because it's just a lot of like, all right, I take the stuff over here and I validate it and then I put it here, and I take the stuff over here and I validate it and do it over here, right? It's a lot of things where you need a lot of flexibility, but big picture wise, you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And Django forms provide a really nice way to encapsulate a lot of that and take care of a lot of that for you. So much like models, forms, you basically define a class that describes your form. And then from this, you can get a whole lot of functionality, which is really nice. So by default, you can just output the form, right? So you're rendering the form. It's a good starting place. Additionally, you have a bunch of tools for basically validating the data of the form. Just like everything else here, there's lots of tools for changing the specific behavior in any of these levels, right? You can have custom widgets for changing how it gets rendered. You have different ways of rendering the form overall. You can override the validation or extend the validation logic. And you can also do data formatting as far as taking the output and then putting it back into something else when you get the data to process it in your view. Additionally, so this is kind of an example of embedding a form in a template. I think most people could probably handle that. One thing that's of note there is the CSRF token. We'll get in a little bit, but Django has a cross-site request forgery framework, which is pretty solid and has been vetted. You want to be using this. And again, one of those things where actually, if by default, in default configurations, if you don't include that token, things will break, which is good.
Secure by default.
Yes, secure by default. If you do it wrong, it just doesn't work instead of being a security bug, which is where you want to be. One of the other things that then is one of those things where like having all these, of course you could build this yourself, but having these things be done in standard ways results in these kind of really nice side effects or nice things that now become much easier to do. In particular, there are these things called model forms. So since you have programmatic definition of your data and you have programmatic definition of your forms, you now can have very easy tooling to just point something at your model information and just have a form that works, right? Just point it at your model, say what fields you care about. Oh, that was wrong. We'll catch up a little bit. Sorry about that. Right, but you just point it at your model, and basically you get for free. Yeah, we still got a little while here. Sorry about that. Yep, still going. Sweet, almost there. Right, so you point out a model. At that point, it knows what fields are going on. Additionally, it knows the type of those fields, so it knows what a sane form element to display is, how to validate it. Additionally, then, it knows how to take the response from that, shove it back into the model, and shove it in the database, right? So that's all a ton of code that you just didn't have to write, and you don't have to write over and over and over again. Again, there's tons of places where you can override specific functionality as far as like if you need to change how a form gets handled, what fields get exposed, what things can be overwritten, as well as how things get persisted.
So there's generators that'll generate the cookie cutter version of this, that tweak, or is
Not really. So like the boilerplate version of it is literally these like 4 lines. So
so it will do that, and if you run that, it'll throw out the basic form.
right. So basically, this article form class you can just use as a form you would otherwise, and then it just works. So there's not necessarily any code generation going on. If you're really curious, there's these things in Python called metaclasses. That's kind of how Django gets away without doing a ton of code generation. They are awesome and terrifying at the same time. I forget the name of the book. There's a really good, I think Metaprogramming in Python is a really good book. I think Alex Martelli, maybe? I forget the author. I apologize. It's a really good book if you want to get down that particular rabbit hole of crazy. But yeah, so actually, so to your point, right, so here we're just instantiating an instance of the article form, and then we're just using it like we would a form. So again, lots of things you could dig in here. Lots of built-in widgets, but you can provide your own as far as like controlling form display and validation. You can handle media uploads and kind of previewing in this. Additionally, there's a bunch of tools for doing like multi-page forms, right? So you imagine like your standard like checkout workflow. It's kind of one form, but it's spread out across 4 different like pages and page views. There's a bunch of tooling to make that kind of stuff easier to manage. In the home stretch here. Yes, very much so. Real quick, not going to get super deep into this. So this kind of gets, at this point, we're basically through most of the web frameworky bits, and now it's getting into kind of the more ancillary tools, which are still super useful and helpful, but you just start whittling down. So Django offers a bunch of tools for making it easier just to make do development, right? So it has conventions and tools for managing settings. Again, for the most part, it's just Python. So if you can describe your setting in Python, congratulations, you're good. It has kind of metadata around this idea of apps, right? So apps are kind of like your top level things inside of a Django project. Those might be things you build yourself. It might be things you grab from third parties. This is something that's actually gotten a lot more mature in the last 2 releases. Exceptions handling, the manage.py stuff. There's a bunch of test tooling, right? So Django has basically an augmentation on top of the built-in Python unit test framework that gives you some nice stuff as far as doing automating, doing database rollbacks between each test to provide better data consistency and environment consistency between tests without necessarily having to do a full database rebuild between each test, which can be really nice. A bunch of other kind of tools for introspecting templates or like shortcutting, getting it into the parts of the framework that you just care about to test some functionality without necessarily doing full like integration tests, which while useful are unbelievably slow. It can be hard to identify what's going on. So testing tools are pretty solid. And then deployment. This is mostly guidance as opposed to specific tools. The short version of deployment with Django is use Whiskey, which is kind of like a standard Python. It's basically a standard way that you do an HTTP application in Python. There's a bunch of servers for Whiskey. They point you out a bunch of them, give you some guidance around that. And static files. In production, you never should be serving static files through Django itself. It's a performance thing. Python's slow at dealing with just large chunks of binary. Apache and Nginx are a lot better at that. But again, they have lots of really good feedback on that, as well as how to handle errors and kind of tools for around that, which is nice. The admin. This is kind of one of the shinier features for Django. So again, you can automate the building of you have a programmatic description of your data. You have a programmatic way to build forms. Accordingly, you can get a really easy out-of-the-box CRUD interface to all your data, right? It's certainly, this was, again, one of those places where if the admin works the way you want, great, fantastic. If it doesn't, there are knobs and tools to change it. But if you're fundamentally changing what it's trying to do, you're likely going to probably cause more trouble for yourself than it is. So just be conscious of like when you're going down a place of, oh, this is almost what I want, but I just need to change it. Just be careful about how far down that road you go. There aren't great pictures of it in here, but like the admins, it's a nice, just like turn it on, get an easy web CRUD interface to your data. It's cool, with lots of knobs and whatnot to tweak it. It's there, you can check it out. Security, Django has a ton of useful security features, some of which I touched on. One of the particular things that's worth noting overall with security with Django is Django's been around long enough and has a large enough community where all the security features have been fairly heavily vetted by people who know what they are doing, right? Security is usually, right, especially when you get into like cryptographic signing, this is not something you should be implementing yourself. It is so easy to get wrong in really subtle ways that just make it completely pointless. And the Django stuff has been really well vetted and has helped, you know, it's also been fairly well battle tested, right? Like it's been in the wild in places that are much more likely targets than you. In all likeliness. Don't strictly know what you're doing. So a lot of what this documentation gets into, overall opinions about how security is handled in the project as well as in the code. Some of the stuff that just happens without you necessarily noticing is, so the ORM does a lot to basically prevent, to handle data properly so that you're not doing SQL injection attack or vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. Similarly, the templating system default HTML escapes everything going out, so you don't do cross-site scripting. There's tools for doing clickjacking protection. If you don't know what that means, feel free to read up. It's fun. Similarly, tools for preventing cross-site request forgery, cryptographic signing. So if like you want to persist like session data in cookies, this gives you a way to basically put that data in the cookie, not necessarily have it be hidden because like the user knows their own data, but have it be so that you know that it's not been modified, which is a useful tool. There's a bunch of internationalization and localization tools. This is something I personally know very little about, but I do know that if you do have to do it, it is a really painful and complicated world. So it's there. Also highlighting time zones. A few years ago, Django went through and improved how they're handling time zones in a bunch of places. I don't know how much you ever had to deal with them, but they're awful and complicated. If you want to buy a bottle of whiskey, I will happily tell you all the horrible things about time zones, and we'll maybe be halfway through the story when we finish the bottle of whiskey. They're awful, but Django does its best to make them as easy as possible. There's documentation and guidance on how to improve performance and just not do things in a slow way. Django runs on a bunch of different Python implementations. So much like Ruby or JavaScript, there's a bunch of different actual implementations of the language. Two of the more widely distributed ones, so kind of the default for Django is Python 2. It's kind of probably what most people are running in production generally for Python. Jython actually is pretty cool if you're in like a more enterprising environment. Django actually has built-in tooling so that if you are running on Jython, you can just run a command, and it'll build a WAR file with your app in it. That, as far as anybody on the outside is concerned, is just another Java app. There's actually been some pretty great talks on from people about how they've snuck Django into organizations using that kind of functionality. And Python 3. Django works on Python 3. It's the whole story. GeoDjango. If you're doing GIS stuff, this is super cool. So just like the normal Django ORM, it basically just augments the ORM so that you can do GIS stuff within here. So what this is saying is, give me basically the countries that contain this point, right? And so under the covers, all the hard stuff is probably be doing by PostGIS. I think there's a few pluggable backends, but PostGIS is really probably the one you want to be using. And it gives you a ton of tools for having nice ways to do geo stuff. It also has a bunch of tooling built on top of other libraries to handle weird stuff like translating between different coordinate and projection systems and so on. But again, most people probably don't need it, but one of the cooler and more obscure features of Django. And then there's a ton of just kind of common, if you're starting from zero, you probably need to build this at some point kind of stuff. Authentication, there are pluggable user models. So you can basically describe the user that you want, but then have a bunch of stuff that works out of the box as far as like login, password hashing, right? There's a really solid password hashing framework that provides a bunch of known good implementations for doing password hashing, but also providing mechanisms for handling versioning and migrating across versions, because eventually you're probably going to have to change it. And then also a bunch of built-in views for doing login, logout, registration, and session handling, right? So keeping somebody logged in, keeping track of data around that user, really nice. Caching, they provide kind of consistent API that lets you normalize out different caching implementations. More or less looks like key value store with TTLs. There's also different levels of caching, right? So they have stuff at the template level and then just that lower level key value thing. And it has pluggable backends for in-memory, memcache, Redis, I think Tokyo maybe. Logging, this basically just makes the configuration on Python's built-in logging a bit easier and has a bunch of built-in logging for basically Django internals that you might be interested in, and like general request handling and so on. The built-in Python logger can be really kind of confusing to configure, so this actually is really nice as far as making that an easier process. Email sending, there's basically, again, a library that handles kind of normalizing email handling across different providers. So if you want to just do straight SMTP, you can do that, but you can also then have a plugin backend for SendGrid or Mailgun or SCS, Amazon's thing. And it all works pretty nicely. Similarly, tools for handling attachments and multi-type emails. So like if you want to do plain text and HTML in the same email, you can do that. RSS feed generation is a thing. Pagination, a lot of times if you're doing a CMS-y kind of thing, you probably need to do this. Some really easy tools for doing that work with the ORM. Messages framework, this is kind of like those flash messages, right? Like you say, somebody submits a form and you're just sending them back to like a listing page and you just want to say, hey, your thing worked one time and then not have that show up. There's tooling to do that. Serialization, if you need to spit stuff out into disk and manage stuff like that, it can be nice. This one's a little weird, but it's there. Sessions, I kind of talked about sitemaps. If you care about SEO, you probably need to generate Google sitemaps. This helps you do that. It's largely based off the URL schemes and some metadata about your apps. Static files management. This is kind of an optional thing, but it's still useful. So this is kind of, you think of like a built-in version of like Grunt or Browserify or something like that, where basically it's a tool for managing your asset compilation pipeline, right? So if you need to figure out where all your CSS files are and then concatenate those together and then run them through some kind of uglify thing or similar for JavaScript, it helps you manage that. And then it also provides tooling or allows for plugins that make it easy to upload that to a CDN during deploy or something like that. And data validation. This is basically documentation about some of Django's internals that most of the time you shouldn't need to muck with too much, but if you're doing some certain things, it's good to know about. And it is publicly documented, so it's consistent. You can build on top of it. And finally, Django documentation about the open source project itself. This is one of the most valuable bits of Django, right? The community around Django is just a really solid, healthy community, right? Like there's a lot of active contributors. There's lots of big companies using it, lots of small companies using it. The mailing list in the IRC channel is super healthy. There are user groups in most cities. If there isn't a Django user group where you are, if you go to the Python user group or the Linux users group, you'll probably find some Django folks. And overall, it's just like a fairly healthy, inclusive, people are looking to help kind of community. And it is solid. Additionally, there are a variety of third-party libraries and tools that you can go discover. This is a good starting place for a lot of that. So that's most of what I got. Before I finish, a quick shameless plug. So like I mentioned, I work at Bitly. You might guess we are hiring. We're mostly based in New York and Denver, but we're always happy to talk to folks. We technically do a little bit of Django, but not a whole lot, but we do a lot of Python and Go, and we do some fun distributed system stuff that I'll be talking about later today. With that, thank you.